Imagine waking up to discover that your empire is hemorrhaging $800,000 every single day. Not every month, not every week, but every 24 hours, another nearly $1 million chunk of your legacy evaporates into thin air. By 2003, Lego, the brand that had been crowned the toy of the century twice over, wasn't just struggling. It was in a full-blown, catastrophic cardiac arrest. The Danish giant that taught the world how to build was now providing a masterclass in how to self-destruct. We are talking about a total deficit of nearly $300 million in a single year. With sales crashing like a poorly constructed tower in the hands of a hyperactive toddler, it was the financial equivalent of stepping barefoot on a sharp plastic brick in the dark. A sudden, blinding agony that leaves you gasping for air and wondering how something so simple could hurt this much. For decades, the Christiansen family had presided over a kingdom of colorful plastic, convinced that their formula was as unbreakable as the bricks themselves. But the arrogance of success is a hell of a drug. They had become so convinced of their own invincibility that they stopped looking at the blueprints. They were bleeding cash, losing market share, and facing an existential crisis that threatened to turn their iconic headquarters into a giant, plastic-filled graveyard. "Don't worry," the executives probably whispered in their glass-walled offices. "We're a household name. The kids love us." Well, newsflash. Kids don't buy toys with nostalgia, and banks don't accept brand heritage as a mortgage payment. The reality was grim, cold, and smelled like burning plastic. They had lost the plot, burned the script, and were now wandering aimlessly in a desert of their own making. This wasn't just a bad quarter. It was the end of an era, a slow-motion car crash involving millions of tiny interlocking parts. You might think a company this big would have a safety net, but as the red ink began to drown the balance sheets, it became clear that the only thing Lego was building was its own funeral pyre. The arrogance was the most shocking part, the belief that they could simply innovate their way out of a disaster by doing everything except making great toys. They were playing a high-stakes game of poker with the company's life, and they were holding a losing hand. The world was watching the collapse of a legend, and the question wasn't if they would fall, but how loud the crash would be when they finally hit the bottom. So, how did a company built on the rock-solid foundation of interlocking bricks end up in a landfill of its own making? Simple. They caught a terminal case of corporate identity crisis. In the late 90s, the geniuses in the boardroom looked at their perfectly profitable plastic bricks and decided they were boring. They were terrified of the digital age, convinced that kids would ditch physical toys for pixels faster than you can say, Game Boy. Instead of doubling down on what made them great, they started acting like a drunk billionaire at a tech auction. They weren't just a toy company anymore. They wanted to be a lifestyle brand. They launched jewelry lines for girls because nothing says sophistication like plastic bracelets, and clothing brands that nobody asked for. They dumped millions into video games they didn't know how to produce, and television shows that lacked any soul. It was a frantic, desperate scramble to be everything to everyone, and in the process, they became nothing to anyone. Imagine a master chef who suddenly decides his restaurant should also sell tires, provide dental work, and offer skydiving lessons. That was Lego. They increased the number of unique pieces from 600 to over 12,000. 12,000! Every time a designer wanted a slightly different shade of green or a weirdly shaped window, the company just said, "Sure, why not?" While the logistics team wept in the corners of their warehouses. The manufacturing costs were astronomical. They were making specialized parts for sets that sold 5 copies, essentially burning money to satisfy the whims of designers who had forgotten that the whole point of Lego was that the pieces were supposed to fit together. "We need to be innovative," they shouted, while ignoring the fact that their innovation was literally bankrupting them. You see, When you lose focus, you lose your shirt. They were trying to build a global media empire on a foundation of crumbling plastic, and the weight of their own ambition was crushing the life out of the company. They were so busy dreaming of Hollywood and high fashion that they forgot how to make a basic police station that actually stayed together. It was a spectacular display of hubris, a masterclass in how to alienate your core audience while lighting your cash reserves on fire. They were standing on a mountain of specialized, useless parts, looking down at a bottom line that was screaming in agony. And the worst part, they still thought they were winning. In the late 90s, Lego was like a drowning man clutching at a jagged piece of wood that might just be a shark's fin. They were desperate. So, they did something that made the traditionalists in Billund gasp so hard they nearly choked on their organic muesli. They called George Lucas. You have to understand, for nearly 70 years, Lego had a moral compass as rigid as their plastic. Their philosophy was no war toys, no violence, and absolutely no guns. And then suddenly, they're sitting across a table from the man who literally invented the Death Star. It was like a pacifist monk deciding to open a shooting range because he needed to pay the rent. This was the start of a high-stakes gambling game with the stars. The internal backlash was legendary. The old guard thought they were selling their soul to a galaxy far, far away. "We make educational tools," they cried, "not plastic instruments of intergalactic genocide." But the bank accounts didn't care about moral superiority. This was a marriage that felt entirely unnatural to the company's DNA, a clash between Danish craftsmanship and Hollywood commercialism. The deal was signed in 1999, right as the hype for The Phantom Menace was reaching a fever pitch. It was a massive gamble. Licensing fees are the vampires of the business world. They suck your margins dry before you've even sold a single box. Lego was essentially handing over a huge chunk of their potential profit to Lucasfilm for the privilege of putting a Jedi in a cardboard box. Imagine the scene. These buttoned-up Danish executives trying to figure out how to turn a grainy, bearded hermit like Obi-Wan Kenobi into a smiling yellow figurine. They were terrified. You're sitting there thinking, oh, it's Star Wars. It's a guaranteed hit. But back then, it was a scandal. If this failed, the licensing costs alone would be the final nail in their plastic coffin. They weren't just building a toy set. They were building a bridge to a hyper-commercialized future that many inside the company absolutely loathed. They were betting the entire farm on a bunch of space wizards and plastic lightsabers, praying to a force they didn't even understand, while the hooves of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were already thundering outside their doors. The force didn't just awaken. It kicked the door down and started throwing money at everyone like a winning slot machine in a smoky Vegas basement. The launch of Lego Star Wars was, on the surface, a triumph of biblical proportions. Kids who hadn't touched a brick in years were suddenly screaming for X-Wings and TIE fighters, and the sets were flying off the shelves so fast the cardboard boxes probably had friction burns. For a fleeting, glorious moment, the suits in Billund breathed a sigh of relief, wiped the sweat from their brows, and congratulated themselves on being the smartest guys in the room. They thought they had found the Holy Grail, a magic wand that could turn plastic into gold without them having to fix a single internal problem. But here's the thing about magic wands. They usually come with a very fine print that you only read when it's too late. Lego Star Wars wasn't a cure. It was a high-grade narcotic. It provided a massive artificial surge of adrenaline to a body that was still riddled with financial cancer. Sure, the revenue numbers looked great on a PowerPoint slide, but look closer at the margins and you'd see a horror show. George Lucas isn't exactly known for his charity work. He was taking a massive double-digit percentage off the top. Every time a kid bought a Millennium Falcon, a huge chunk of that cash bypassed Lego entirely and flew straight into the Lucasfilm vaults. Lego was doing all the heavy lifting, the design, the manufacturing, the shipping, the retail battles, and handing the cream of the crop over to a man who already owned a ranch larger than some European countries. The social injustice was palpable. While factory workers feared for their jobs, the company was essentially subsidizing Hollywood's next yacht. The dependency was terrifying. Lego had become a slave to the Hollywood release calendar. When a movie was out, they were kings. When the screen went dark, sales plummeted like a stone because there was no new hype to feed the machine. It was a cycle of feast and famine that left the company's core business, the stuff that actually belonged to them, rotting in the corner. They were so distracted by the shiny lightsabers that they ignored the fact that their own themes, the ones they didn't have to pay royalties on, were dying a slow, painful death. They were essentially paying a fortune for the privilege of working for someone else, while their own house was still on fire. They were addicted to the Star Wars hit, using it to mask the stench of their own incompetence, convinced that as long as the Force was with them, they didn't need a map. It was a delusion of galactic proportions, and the crash that was coming would be far more painful than any movie villain could ever imagine. By 2004, the glitter of the Star Wars premiere had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard hangover that no amount of Jedi mind tricks could fix. The company wasn't just in trouble. It was staring into the abyss, and the abyss was checking its watch, wondering when Lego would finally jump. They posted a staggering loss of over 1.4 billion Danish kroner. To the uninitiated, that's roughly $230 million of pure, unadulterated failure in a single year. The banks were no longer knocking. They were preparing the battering rams. Every single day, the company was hemorrhaging cash so fast you could almost hear the sound of plastic melting. The once mighty Christiansen family, who had built this empire from a small carpentry shop, were now facing the very real possibility of losing everything. Imagine 70 years of heritage, 3 generations of toil, and the childhood joy of millions, all about to be sold off to a private equity firm that would likely strip the company for parts and sell the brand name to a budget supermarket. The smell of death was in the air. The internal culture was a mess of finger-pointing and not my department excuses. They had become a bloated, slow-moving beast that couldn't even see the hunters closing in. Retailers were losing faith. Warehouses were overflowing with unsold junk, those weird jewelry kits and half-baked video games, and the core product was being neglected like a middle child at a birthday party. They had tried to buy their way into relevance and ended up buying a one-way ticket to insolvency. You have to appreciate the irony. A company that sells play was now being played by the most ruthless forces of global finance. They were a heartbeat away from being a has-been brand, a nostalgic footnote in a business textbook under the chapter titled How to Fail While Everyone Still Loves You. The situation was so dire that the CEO, Kjeld Kirk Christiansen, the grandson of the founder, had to step down. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the family. They were the royalty of Denmark, and their crown was made of cheap, breaking plastic. They were standing on the deck of the Titanic, and the band wasn't even playing anymore. They were packing up their instruments and looking for the lifeboats. If a miracle didn't happen, and fast, the world was about to lose its favorite toy to the cold, calculating hands of debt collectors. It was the ultimate low in a story of heights, a moment of such profound failure that it felt like the very concept of imagination was being foreclosed upon. They had the biggest brand in the world and the most popular movie franchise in history, and they were still dying. In walked the man who would either be the savior of the brick or its ultimate executioner. His name was Jørgen Vig Knudstorp, and to the traditionalists in Billund, he must have looked like a nightmare dressed in a McKinsey suit. He wasn't a toy person. He didn't grow up dreaming of plastic pirates or castle sieges. He was a consultant, a man who looked at a pile of colorful bricks and saw nothing but inefficient inventory and a catastrophic lack of fiscal discipline. At just 35 years old, this outsider was handed the keys to a 70-year-old family dynasty that was currently on fire. If you were a betting person in 2004, you would have put your money on him being the guy who turned out the lights and sold the property to a luxury condo developer. Knudstorp didn't come in with a gentle touch or a reassuring smile. He came in with a chainsaw. He performed a surgery without anesthesia on the company's very soul. His first move? He looked at the beloved Legoland parks, the crown jewels of the brand, and essentially said, "Get rid of them." To the Christiansen family, this was heresy. It was like selling your own children to pay off a gambling debt. But Knudstorp was cold, calculating, and absolutely right. Lego was a toy company that had forgotten how to make toys because it was too busy pretending to be Disney. He sold a majority stake in the parks because they were a massive capital drain that the company simply couldn't afford while it was bleeding out on the floor. Then came the great culling of the bricks. Remember those 12,000 unique pieces? Knudstorp looked at that mountain of plastic vanity and hacked it down to about 6,000. He told the designers, the creative geniuses who thought they were artists, that they were now on a strict diet. No more custom-molded, one-off pieces for every single set. You use the pieces we have, or you find a way to justify the cost of a new mold with blood, sweat, and a very convincing spreadsheet. He forced them to think inside the box, literally. He understood something the previous leadership had ignored. Creativity thrives under constraints, but businesses die under excess. He didn't care about innovation if it didn't lead to a profit margin. He was the cold splash of water to a company that had been hallucinating from its own success for far too long. He turned the focus back to the value of the brick. You see, the Star Wars deal had been a temporary bandage, but Knudstorp was the one who actually cleaned the wound. He made the designers sit down and actually play with the toys to understand why a child picks up a brick in the first place. He was the man who had to tell a room full of emotional Danes that their feelings didn't matter if the cash flow was negative. It was brutal, it was clinical, and it was exactly what was needed to stop the heart from flatlining. The outsider was the only one who could see that the empire wasn't just crumbling. It was being built with the wrong pieces. The cleanup wasn't just a fiscal slaughter. It was a spiritual homecoming that felt more like a brutal exorcism. Knudstorp realized that the system of play was the company's holy grail, but they had been using it as a paperweight. He essentially told the creative team to stop trying to be avant-garde artists and start being architects of the imagination again. If a plastic piece couldn't be used in 10 different ways, it was garbage. He was forcing them to return to the simple, elegant logic of the brick. The idea that a handful of blocks could be a castle today and a spaceship tomorrow. It sounds poetic, doesn't it? But for the designers who had grown used to the anything-goes era of the late 90s, this was a cold, hard slap in the face with a 204 plastic beam. You have to appreciate the irony. A company built on unlimited imagination had become so unimaginative that it thought it needed 12,000 different specialized parts to keep a child's attention. Knudstorp didn't just cut the inventory. He reconnected with the adult fans of Lego, the nerds and hobbyists the company had ignored for decades because they weren't the target demographic. These people were the keepers of the flame, the ones who understood the magic of the mitred corner and the structural integrity of a Technic beam while the executives were busy chasing clothing lines and jewelry trends. By listening to the fans, Lego realized that their limitations were actually their greatest strength. This was the moment the Star Wars relationship finally started to make sense. Instead of Star Wars being a life support machine for a dying brand, it became a playground for the system. They stopped making weird, specialized action figure parts and started making sets that felt like Lego first and Star Wars second. They discovered that you didn't need a custom molded face for every single alien if you could build a recognizable world out of the basic bricks people already loved. It was a return to the core, a stripping away of the corporate fat to reveal the muscle underneath. They were no longer just a licensed toy manufacturer. They were the masters of a creative language that just happened to speak Jedi. The great culling had saved their bank account, but the return to the brick saved their soul. proving that sometimes to move forward into the future, you have to stop and remember exactly who you were before you got greedy and lost your way. Today, LEGO isn't just a toy company. It is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the global play industry, valued at over $9 billion. It is a media juggernaut, a cinematic powerhouse, and a cultural icon that has transcended the toy aisle to become a fundamental pillar of modern childhood. But don't let the shiny, high-gloss finish of their current success fool you into thinking this was a painless evolution. The $1 billion rescue wasn't just about Star Wars saving LEGO. It was about LEGO finally learning how to save itself from the terminal disease of its own greed and corporate vanity. They had to hit the absolute bottom, staring into the cold, gray eyes of liquidation, before they realized that their greatest asset wasn't a license or a movie tie-in. It was the humble interlocking brick they had spent years trying to replace with cheap gimmicks and misguided lifestyle garbage. The aftermath of this crisis serves as a cynical reminder of how close we came to losing a legend. If Knudstorp hadn't performed that brutal corporate lobotomy, your children would be playing with generic off-brand blocks sold at a discount because the LEGO name would have been auctioned off to the highest bidder years ago. The social injustice of it all is that thousands of workers nearly lost their livelihoods, not because the product was bad, but because the people at the top were playing a high-stakes game of pretend with the company's future. They were so busy trying to build a digital empire that they forgot how to build a simple house out of plastic. They treated their heritage like a burden rather than a blueprint, and it nearly cost them everything. The lesson here is as sharp as a plastic brick to the heel. Success is the most dangerous drug in business. It makes you blind, it makes you arrogant, and it makes you think you can ignore the very laws of physics that built your foundation. LEGO survived because they were forced to remember that they were a construction company, not a fashion house or a theme park operator. They used the force of Star Wars to buy them time, but it was the cold, hard logic of the balance sheet and a return to the system of play that actually brought them back from the dead. They learned that you can have all the shiny licenses in the galaxy, but if your core is hollow, the whole tower eventually collapses. So the next time you see a massive $1,000 LEGO Star Wars set on a shelf, remember that it isn't just a toy. It's a monument to a near-death experience. It's the result of a desperate last-ditch gamble that somehow, against all odds, managed to turn a pile of debt into a mountain of gold. LEGO didn't just survive. They conquered, but they did it by finally admitting that they were wrong. They stopped trying to be everything and settled for being the best. In a world of fleeting digital distractions, they proved that there is still a billion-dollar market for things that actually fit together. Just make sure you don't lose your soul or your shirt trying to find the next big thing when the answer was already sitting in a box in your attic.